Curiosity began it all, an ache that stirred in the quiet corners of Clara Wynn's solitude, like a bird fluttering against the cage of her heart. For 5 long winters she had lived alone in the wilderness, far from the chatter of Willow Creek, where gossip and pity went hand in hand. Her cabin stood at the edge of the pines, where snow buried the world in silence, and only the whisper of wind kept her company. She'd once been the daughter of a rancher, bright-eyed and eager for life, but fever had taken everyone she loved, leaving behind an emptiness so wide she'd chosen to vanish into it. Each day was a repetition of survival: chop the wood, tend the fire, mend what was broken. Yet under all that rhythm, she carried a question she could never silence. Was this how her life would end, unseen, unremembered, fading into snow? The world around her was beautiful but cruel. The mountains loomed like watchful gods, and the forest bore its secrets with frozen breath. Sometimes, when dusk fell purple across the ridge, she would stand at the door and listen, not for wolves, but for something else. Footsteps, perhaps. A voice. Proof that she still existed among the living. But the only answer came from the creak of trees and the far-off cry of a hawk cutting through the lonely expanse. On those evenings she would press her hands to her chest, feeling the slow, stubborn beat of her heart, wondering if she still had enough warmth left to share with anyone. Then came the storm. It began as a murmur of wind against the windowpane, then grew into a howl that rattled the very bones of her cabin. The skies split open, and snow fell like feathers from a wounded sky. Clara hurried to secure the shutters, the lantern's flame flickering in her trembling hands. The storm had a way of making her feel smaller, as if the world could swallow her whole. Yet even as she braced against the cold, curiosity pricked through fear when she heard it, a distant rhythm beneath the gale, steady and deliberate. Hooves, she froze, breath catching in her throat. Visitors were rare this deep into the woods. She thought perhaps she was imagining it, until a shadow moved through the white. A rider. The figure grew clearer as it approached, tall, broad-shouldered, the horse laboring against the wind. Her first instinct was to bar the door and douse the light, as she had done with peddlers or strangers before. But something in the way the man leaned forward, weary yet persistent, stirred that old ache of compassion she thought she'd buried years ago. A knock sounded, firm but not demanding. "Ma'am?" The voice was roughened by cold and distance. "I seek shelter, if you'd allow it. Storm caught me on the trail." Clara hesitated. Her hand hovered over the latch, her mind at war between caution and kindness. Finally, she opened the door. Snow swirled in, clinging to his coat, to the brim of his hat. His face was half hidden by a scarf, but his eyes, steady, dark, and searching, met hers with quiet sincerity. "Just till morning," he said softly. "I won't trouble you longer." "You'd better come in before you freeze," she replied, stepping aside. The stranger entered, tall enough that he had to duck beneath the doorframe. He moved with the restrained grace of someone used to command but not arrogance. As he peeled off his gloves, she noticed the fine leather, the silver trim on his coat, marks of a man not born to hardship, though clearly acquainted with it. He introduced himself simply, Elias Thorne, a rancher from the valley to the south, caught on his way home by the storm. She nodded without offering her name. In places like this, names were not easily given. Still, as she stirred the fire, she found herself speaking more than she had in months, asking where he'd come from, whether he'd eaten, what brought him out so late. His answers were short but honest. There was loss in his tone, though he never named it. They ate together in silence broken only by the crackle of pine logs. The cabin's single candle cast soft gold against the wooden walls, revealing years of solitude in every corner: handmade quilts, jars of dried herbs, a single rocking chair worn smooth from use. Elias glanced around, then back at her. "You live here alone?" "Yes," she said, her voice steady. He nodded, as though he understood without needing her reasons. "Must take strength," he murmured. "It takes remembering," she replied. "Strength fades quicker than memory." Something flickered between them, a recognition of pain, of endurance. They were two souls shaped by loss but not entirely hollowed out. The wind screamed outside, rattling the shutters, yet inside the air grew softer, warmer. Elias offered to tend the fire, while she set out blankets. He worked carefully, his large hands gentle with the smallest motions. When she brought him tea, their fingers brushed. She felt a shock of warmth travel up her arm. For a moment she wanted to pull away, but instead she let the moment linger. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her without pity. Later, as the storm deepened, he spoke quietly, almost to himself. "Funny how a man can own half the valley and still feel like a ghost in it." She looked up. "Maybe you're just lost in the wrong kind of silence." He smiled faintly. "Maybe so." Outside, the snow buried the world. Inside, time slowed. Clara found herself watching the rise and fall of his shoulders as he dozed near the fire, exhaustion softening his rugged features. There was something achingly human in the sight, a reminder that even the strongest men sought warmth in the cold. When the logs burned low, she draped a blanket over him. He stirred, murmuring thanks, eyes barely open. "You're kind, Miss Clara," she said softly. "Clara Wynne." He nodded once before sleep took him again. The night stretched on, filled with the storm's fury and the quiet rhythm of another breathing beside her hearth. She sat in her chair, watching the snow through the window, feeling something shift inside her. Curiosity had led her to open the door, but it was something deeper, something nameless, that kept her from closing it again. She realized she didn't fear the silence tonight. It was no longer empty. It had become a space shared. When dawn came, the storm was gone. The world outside lay still, draped in unbroken white. Elias stirred, straightening his coat. "You've my gratitude," he said, meeting her gaze with sincerity rare in men of wealth. "If you ever need anything, a favor, supplies, a word to town, my door's open." Clara smiled faintly. "And if you ever need shelter again, you know where to find it." He paused at the threshold, looking out at the trail. Then he unpinned a small silver button from his coat and set it on her table. "So I don't forget," he said. The door closed behind him with the soft thud of promise. Clara stood there long after he'd gone, the morning light spilling through the frosted window. She picked up the button, turning it over in her palm. The metal was still warm from his touch. For the first time in years, she felt the faint, fragile pull of something she hadn't dared to feel: hope. And as she watched the distant shape of a rider fade into the horizon, she knew the story wasn't over. Something had begun in the snow, and it would not end with his leaving. For weeks, the world was silent again, yet it no longer felt the same. Clara moved through her days as if in a dream, every sound of wind or hoofbeat stirring an ache she didn't know how to quiet. She told herself Elias Thorne had been just another traveler passing through the storm, a chapter meant to close with the thaw. But when the snow melted into streams, she found herself glancing toward the ridge each morning, as though expecting the echo of hooves. Curiosity had first opened her door to him. Now, longing kept it half open to the world she'd once feared. The silver button sat on her mantle, glinting in the firelight, a quiet reminder that connection, once found, did not fade easily. One afternoon in early spring, when the forest began to thaw and the sky lost its iron weight, a shadow appeared again along the distant trail. Her breath caught before reason could stop her. A horse. A rider. And then she saw him clearly, Elias, his hat pulled low, his figure steady as ever. He dismounted with the ease of someone who'd decided long before that he would return. Clara stepped outside, heart pounding. "Fence still standing?" he called with a faint smile. "Mostly," she replied, her voice trembling despite her calm face. "I brought supplies," he said, lifting a sack from the saddle. "And a peace offering." From his coat pocket he drew a small book, worn at the corners. "Poems," he explained. "Figured a woman who braves winters alone might need a few borrowed words now and then." She took it gingerly, tracing the embossed letters as if touching something sacred. "You didn't have to come all this way," she murmured. "Didn't have to." he said simply. Wanted to. The days that followed moved slower, richer. They repaired the fence, cleaned the chimney, shared quiet meals that stretched into evenings. She began to notice the small things about him, the way he ran a hand through his hair when thinking, the stillness in him that spoke of years spent listening more than speaking. He noticed her too, how she always hummed softly when tending the fire, how her eyes turned bright whenever she spoke of the wilderness as if it were an old friend. What began as gratitude ripened into an unspoken tenderness that neither dared name. It wasn't the feverish love of youth but something steadier, like spring returning to frozen ground. Then came the first rumor. Clara heard it from a trapper passing through, a whisper carried from town. They said the wealthy rancher Elias Thorne had been keeping company with the hermit woman in the hills. Some said pity drove him, others said shame would follow. She pretended it didn't matter, but when Elias returned days later, his eyes carried the weight of those words. They're talking, he said quietly, setting down his gloves. Men who've never known your name think they have the right to shape it. I'm used to talk, she said, but her voice betrayed her. Let them tire of it. He looked at her then, a storm behind his calm. It's not you they judge, it's me. They think I've lost my senses, spending my time here instead of at the ranch. And have you? She asked softly. Maybe I've finally found them. He answered. The next days were tense. He came less often, burdened by responsibilities she could not share. Clara tried to fill the silence with work, but every creak of the windmill or whisper of pine needles seemed to ask where he had gone. She knew he was fighting something, perhaps pride, perhaps fear, but pride was a battle she understood too well. She'd built her life around it once, around the belief that needing anyone was a kind of weakness. Now, she wasn't sure what strength even meant. When he finally returned, his expression was weary, his horse flecked with mud. They're saying I should sell the ranch, he said, removing his hat. That a man who forgets his duty for a ghost in the woods doesn't deserve what he's built. She met his eyes. Am I a ghost to you? His reply came like a confession. You're the only thing that feels real anymore. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley, distant but promising. Clara turned toward the window, her reflection trembling in the glass. You can't fight them forever, she whispered. They'll tear you apart for wanting something as simple as peace. He stepped closer, his voice low but sure. Then let them try. I've fought men, storms, and loneliness. This, he gestured between them, the narrow space filled with unspoken feeling. This is worth the fight. Her hand trembled as he took it, but she didn't pull away. For a heartbeat, she let herself believe in the impossible, that love could bloom even in the shadow of judgment. But the world was not kind to quiet happiness. The next morning, Elias was gone before sunrise. His horse's tracks faded into the forest, and the day unfolded without him. One day became 3, then 5. Clara told herself he had business at the ranch, that he'd return when the storm in his heart had settled. Yet as the nights passed, the silence grew heavier, sharper. She sat by the fire, the book of poems unopened beside her, and felt the familiar ache of loss return to her chest. It was different this time, not the numbness of grief but the ache of hope denied. She had begun to believe in warmth again, and now the cold had found her. Then, one night, the wind rose suddenly, fierce and wild. A storm, unexpected for spring. She went to the window, half dreading what she might see, half praying. Through the blur of snow, a flicker of movement caught her eye. A horse. A rider fighting through the white. She ran to the door and flung it open, heart hammering. There he was, Elias, face pale from cold, breath coming in clouds. I tried to live without this, he said hoarsely. And I couldn't. He stepped forward, the storm swirling around them. She reached for his hand, her fingers cold against his, and pulled him inside. The fire roared to life as if welcoming them both home. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the sound of wind and heartbeat mingling. Finally, she whispered, Then stay. Stay till spring, or forever. Elias looked at her as though she'd spoken a vow. Forever sounds good, he said, voice breaking on the edges of relief. They sat together by the fire, their shadows touching across the floor. Outside, the snow softened, falling in slow, deliberate silence. In the fragile light, Clara saw the man not as the rancher the town gossiped about, but as someone stripped of pride and pretense, just a soul seeking warmth. And perhaps that was all she had ever been too. Later, as sleep began to pull at her eyes, Elias spoke softly. Do you ever think the world forgets people like us? She smiled faintly. Maybe. But the world's memory isn't what matters. What we remember, that's what keeps us alive. The wind eased. The storm passed. In the quiet that followed, they remained by the fire, two weary hearts learning the shape of peace. Outside, the first light of dawn crept across the snow, and it seemed to Clara that even the land itself had softened, forgiving at last. Somewhere in the stillness, she thought she heard the echo of that first knock on her door, the sound that had changed everything. And as Elias's hand tightened gently around hers, she realized the wilderness no longer felt empty. It had found its voice again, warm and human, carried in the breath of the man beside her. The snow fell quietly, endlessly, as though the heavens themselves were blessing what had been found beneath its hush.